webinar. I'm Professor Lijun Shang at London Metropolitan University. We will start the webinar very, very soon. And before we do this, it's just a small housekeeping I want to address. The webinar will be recorded. Therefore, we would like you to keep your video and the microphone muted throughout the webinar until the question and answer sessions. You can use the chat box to raise your questions at any time. We will monitor your questions, maybe answer your questions straight away, or select the questions to answer it at the question and answer sessions. And there's no any further requirement. It just keep muted because we have a reasonably large number of attendants. So we want you to make sure everybody can hear clearly. As I said, the webinar will be recorded. We will send you some links to review it. And also we will have some surveys for you to give some feedback on the webinar as well. They will come to the end of the webinar. And thanks again, and welcome to take part in this webinar. I think I will ask Mava to start recording so that we can start the session. Mava, are you ready?
Ready, Lijun, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Oh, someone raised your hand. Okay, let's start the webinar now. Okay, very welcome. COVID-19, a global pandemic, and the recently cases of the chemical weapon use has demonstrated the multifaceted nature of the biological and the chemical threat that states faced in the 21st century. This threat has also underscored the importance of strengthening the international norms against the hostile misuse of the chemical and biological science enshrined in the 1975 Biological and Toxin Weapon Convention and the 1997 Chemical Weapon Convention. In July 2018, UK government published the UK Biological Security Strategy. These strategies draws together for the first time the work that takes place across the government to protect the UK and its interests from the significant biological risks, no matter how this occurred and no matter who and what it affects. It reflects on the evolving landscape and sets out how we were building on our existing activities to further improve our ability to reduce and respond to the risk of and to exploit opportunities. In December 2020, the Parliament Joint Committee on the National Security Strategy published its first report for the section 2019 to 2021 on biosecurity and national security. This report focused on the difficulties of integrating the various means of governance within the United Kingdom, but noted that the future biological risk to the UK will evolve rapidly, originating within and beyond its borders. This important central piece of international effort to prevent the misuse of the modern chemistry and biologies the Chemical Weapon Convention and the Biological Toxical Weapon Convention is really come to the public and to most of the parliament. Therefore, in 2020, we started a series of projects on strengthening the biological and chemical weapon conventions aimed to provide the civil society input to biological and chemical security before the BTWC 9th Review Conference in 2021 and the 5th Review Conference of CWC in 2023. One of these projects is presented as a new list research to lawmakers and the general public. This project is selected by London Metropolitan University for funding, and through the UKRI. The outcome of this project is formed as a report to the Parliament, and which forms the topic of today's webinar. We published the outcome of this project and will send the link for anyone to access. And in this seminar, we will discuss the difficulties of integrating the various means of governance external to the United Kingdom in relation to the chemical and biological non-proliferation regimes. We also review the state of the BWC and the CWC and identify practical opportunities to strengthen these critical conventions and guarantee their relevance against the backdrop of rapid scientific technology advances and growing international instabilities. After that, we'll carry out some interviews to get the feedback to the report and the seminars, which we can establish the strong future connections with the Parliament and the public on this important issue. Without further ado, I will hand over our first speaker, Dr. Tatyana Novossiolova, and she will start our webinar. Tatyana, floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Lijun. And so thanks so much for the introduction, and it's a pleasure to be with everyone today. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone joining us today for this webinar. As you can see from the title of my talk, basically I'm going to cover the intersessional program of the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention. So it's the current intersessional program, and I'll be focusing on 3 of the thematic areas that are being addressed in the current intersessional program. And tonight I'll be speaking in my personal capacity. So without further ado, let's start. Probably most of you would be familiar with some of the, or most of the issues that I'm going to touch upon, but please bear with me. So the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention entered into force in 1975. And to give you a little bit of context, so basically the negotiation of the convention very much coincided with the first genetic engineering experiments, gene splicing in the early 1970s, but also in political terms with the unilateral renunciation of biological weapons by President Nixon in the United States, and the subsequent giving up of the offensive capability of the U.S. of biological weapons. In terms of what the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention is, so the convention doesn't really prohibit work with specific biological agents or toxins. Rather, it introduces the general purpose criterion. And what the general purpose criterion does, it's intended to ensure that biological agents and toxins are used only for peaceful purposes. And in addition, what this general purpose criterion does is it seeks to envisage and ensure that future developments and future advances in the life sciences remain covered by the convention. So basically, people drafting the convention very much wanted to foresee that the future advances of the life sciences would be covered by this treaty. At the moment, the Biological and Toxic Weapons Convention has 183 states parties, which may appear a lot, but when compared to other international agreements that address WMD, is actually fewer states parties. Both the Treaty on the Nuclear Non-Proliferation and the Chemical Weapons Convention, which we are going to talk a little bit more later today, have more states parties. Also, in terms of mechanisms, how the Biological and Toxic Weapons Convention works, so it has the review conference, which is held every 5 years, and basically the review conference is the main decision-making body of the convention. And the ninth review conference, as Professor Shang mentioned, is going to be held, well, it's scheduled to take place later this year. So to give you a little bit of background to the intersessional process and what this intersessional program actually is, it was introduced with the decision outcome of the fifth review conference back in 2002. And the idea very much was that to allow states parties to consider issues of relevance to the convention between the review conferences. Even though the 8th review conference was not able to agree an intersessional program, it did make a decision to continue negotiations on this issue at the meeting of states parties in the following year, and that meeting actually agreed the current intersessional program. That intersessional program comprises 5 thematic meetings of states parties, and you can see those listed here, and an annual meeting of states parties. Those meetings are held each year in 2018, 19, and 2020, even though the 2020 meetings have been postponed because of the pandemic and are scheduled to take place at some point in spring this year. In my talk, as I mentioned at the start, I'll be covering 3 bordered areas. So basically the advances in science and technology, strengthening national implementation, and assistance response and preparedness. So this slide really is just to give a very holistic overview of how the different thematic areas come together and tie up together. So if you think about the global or international prohibition of biological and toxic weapons, it really has 2 main objectives. So one is to ensure that the life sciences advances are not misused for hostile purposes, and the other one is to ensure that deliberate disease is countered. And when we think about the national implementation of the Biological and Toxic Weapons Convention, both of these objectives have to be met. And of course, I mean, international cooperation and promoting transparency and trust are key areas in this process. And the speaker after me would be talking a little bit more about those. So, the review of scientific and technological developments. Basically, this thematic area very much covers Article 1 of the Convention and the need for upholding the general purpose criterion. And when you think about it, given what the general purpose criterion is, ensuring that science and technology are used only for peaceful purposes, review of ongoing scientific and technological advances in the life sciences is key to ensuring the integrity of the convention. So there are scientific, and the other thing that has to be mentioned here is that some scientific and technological advances in the life sciences can actually be of benefit to the convention. Others, however, may pose risks. One significant area of research and discussion and consideration to states parties has been the issue of dual-use life science research, which is, or dual-use life science research of concern. The idea that benignly intended life sciences research might actually be used for hostile purposes or misused by actors who would like to cause harm. And examples of such work might be, for instance, experiments or studies that make viruses more contagious, or otherwise to acquire functions that may enhance their virulence, so-called gain-of-function research, or, for instance, studies that may recreate viruses that are extinct, that no longer exist in nature in the laboratory. To preserve the integrity of the convention, of course, there is need to consider the security implications of such work and of dual-use life sciences research in general. And in considering those security implications, it is very much important to ensure that to avoid undue restrictions on research and innovation. And this is what very much states parties to the convention try to do. And in their considerations in the current intersessional process, there are different key proposals for ensuring that science and technological developments are effectively monitored. And those include, for instance, the establishment of a designated scientific advisory body to the convention. There is a proposal for developing a set of guiding principles on responsible conduct for life sciences. And another key area is the testing of applicability of existing frameworks for the assessment and management of risks, of biological risks within the context of the convention. And of course, a key area in this is the need for sustained interaction between scientific and security communities to ensure that risks are actually addressed in ways that do not stifle innovation. So the next thematic area that is being addressed here is the national implementation of the convention. And Article 4 of the convention requires these parties to take any necessary measures to implement the convention at national level. Even though the convention doesn't have a formal mechanism or a formal system for verification, nevertheless, states parties are encouraged to designate a national contact point, which is in charge of coordinating the process of national implementation. And also, back in 1986, at the second review conference of the convention, states parties decided to introduce confidence building measures, which have subsequently been updated and modified over the years. And the purpose of the confidence building measures, of course, being a voluntary mechanism, is really to promote transparency and ensure that ambiguities and suspicions are resolved in a timely manner. Under this mechanism, states parties submit annual reports every year and exchange information on different key areas related to the implementation of the convention. So thinking about the strengthening of national implementation in the current intersessional process, there are a number of key proposals that states parties are considering. Of course, one big area is the review and update of the confidence building measures, very much to ensure their relevance, given that things are changing, not only in the life sciences, but in political terms, how the economy works, and so on and so forth. So those processes need to be captured effectively. Another key area is the mechanism for peer review and exchange visit amongst these parties, which is basically a mechanism that allows states parties to promote transparency, facilitate experience sharing through exchange visits. Another key area that is being considered is the role of integrated national frameworks for biological security, and there have been a number of working papers on how states parties promote such frameworks for facilitated national implementation of the convention. And another key area is the need for for biological security awareness raising and education among life sciences stakeholders. The third thematic area that I'm going to briefly touch upon is Article 7, which is basically a mechanism for states parties to request and receive assistance in case of violation of the convention and exposure to biological weapons use. So this is a key area of the convention, and the effective implementation of this article is essential to ensuring the integrity of the norm against deliberate disease, but also to strengthening global health security. However, in the absence of designated international legal authority, there are practical, logistical, and operational challenges that need to be addressed in order to ensure effective coordination in case of deliberate disease. As part of this thematic area, states parties address a number of key proposals have been tabled in this intersessional process. Some include the development of a standardized procedure for requesting assistance, establishing a roster for emergency response and assistance, and also the establishment of nationally operated teams for biomedical support that can be actually delegated or listed in a BTWC maintained roster. So in a way to sum up, as you can see, I very much like figures. So in a way to sum up and to sort of bring together some of the key issues and some of the key recommendations that we'll list in the report with regard to the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention, one cross-cutting issue that covers all three thematic areas that have been addressed here is the need for engaging the life sciences stakeholders with the convention, and that includes life sciences stakeholders both in public and private sector, whether in academia, industry, or government. And to that end, we do list a number of key proposals, including the development of a biological security code of conduct for life sciences, improving the CBM's mechanism and the CBM systems to keep them up to date and relevant, enhancing the utility of the peer review exercises, and also strengthening international cooperation and coordination in case of deliberate disease. Those are basically some of the key issues that I wanted to touch upon. And now, with that, I would like to thank you for the attention, and I would like to pass the floor to Dr. Simon Whitby of the University of Bradford, who is going to continue the topic on the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for your introductory comments and your overview of MX 2, 3, and 4. Can you hear me okay, Tatyana? I don't know whether you're still on there, on the microphone. So I've probably got the shortest presentation, thanks for that, of all of my colleagues today. And as I've mentioned already, I'm going to talk about MX1 and MX5. So MX1, of course, in this most recent intersessional process relates to cooperation and assistance under Article 10 of the BWC, the BTWC, states parties, of course, have the right to enjoy the fullest possible exchange of equipment, materials, and scientific and technological information of biological agents and toxins for peaceful purposes. And with that in mind, recent discussions in this intersessional process, and since the last review conference, you can see, if you look at the contributions of member countries, in particular in relation to member countries of the Global Partnership, you can see that documents posted on the ICU's website that give detailed accounts of projects that facilitate the implementation of Article 10 in particular. And if you look at the 8th Review Conference document submitted by the Global Partnership, this really is very extensive indeed in terms of the Global Partnership member states' obligations insofar as the implementation of Article 10 of the Convention is concerned, with huge amounts of money being dedicated to projects relating to Article 10 in Africa, in Eurasia, in Central Asia, in Europe, the Middle East, and in the context of multi-regional and global programming. And these documents periodically are produced, I suppose, by the Global Partnership. Many of you will be familiar with these documents. The one I'm referring to in particular that was produced for the 8th Review Conference runs to some 65 pages. So there's a very considerable amount of investment taking place insofar as Global Partnership countries are concerned with respect to the implementation of Article 10 obligations. Also, in the same vein, I suppose, during recent negotiations, the UK has also given an overview of its contributions regarding its Article 10 obligations, and this slightly shortened the overall Global Partnership contribution, but nevertheless, the UK lists some very extensive government-funded research initiatives and other initiatives that relate to Article 10, indeed including some the financing of some of the work that Bradford University has conducted in regard to awareness raising and education. So I've only selected the global partnership in the UK. The US has also reported on its Article 10 and other countries, of course. So without going through a long list of them, but this is, I think, indicative of the extent to which Article 10 obligations are being met by states parties to the convention, who are in a position to offer, I suppose. In order to improve the implementation of Article 10, as many of you will be aware, states parties agreed to create a database system established and administered by the implementation support unit of the BTWC to facilitate requests for and offers of exchange of assistance and cooperation amongst states parties. So I'll move straight into the recommendations that we have arrived at in our report. This is really just a headline news, as it were, in the sense that I don't go into very much detail here, but the 2020 MX1 was, because of the pandemic, took place online, and you know, I got in there and listened to a very interesting webinar and extracted what I thought was some interesting initiatives relating to the implementation of Article 10. And so one notable contribution, I think, it comes in the form of a strategy which set out by the US, actually outlined by Ms. Costa-Camps, in a presentation titled Working Together to Strengthen the Implementation of Article 10 of the Convention. Part of the presentation then transitioned into contribution by outreach coordinator and program specialist from the US Department of State. But the US initiative relates to the better implementation of the database. I think the ISU have done a fantastic job in setting that up, and this initiative relates to how and in what ways this might be improved. So the US have talked about a 3-step process to increase the number of annual reports regarding cooperation and assistance obligations, turning the database into a more comprehensive and useful tool, and via an initiative supported by both the US and India that relates to the creation of a position within the ISU to support cooperation in respect of this article of the convention. A little bit more detail in preparation for the 9th review conference. This initiative is aimed at increasing the number of reports on cooperation and assistance obligations, the better use of Article 10 database to make it more comprehensive and somehow accessible to international organizations, NGOs, and academia as well, and to give the ISU the resources it needs regarding Article 10 to support implementation of this aspect of the convention. The US and India have agreed on the idea, at least, of a voluntary fund to finance this position within the ISU. So that draws to a conclusion the comments that I wanted to make with regard to MX1. So moving on swiftly, as it were, to MX5, and to a particularly contentious aspect of negotiations to strengthen the convention, generally speaking, but the issue about the institutional strengthening that's considered under MX5 obviously relates to the, I suppose, failure of the protocol negotiations, which took place over a 6 or 7 year period, and division, I think, has persisted since the the failure to agree on a compliance and verification protocol to strengthen the convention. Divisions persisted between states parties on this contested issue. And of course, debate has taken place, I suppose, on and off, but during the course of this most recent intersessional process over the benefits and challenges of two different types of approaches, namely a comprehensive approach, which I suppose relates to the idea to resurrect discussions about a verification protocol to strengthen the Biological Weapons Convention. And then on the other hand, a different approach which relies on incremental steps based upon the adoption of a series of individual measures. So I think it goes without saying that the issue of verification continues to lack consensus among states parties, but recent discussions concerning the institutional strengthening of the convention have included a range of proposals, and I've just fished out some headlines: the creation of a multilateral coordinating body based on the BTWC, enhancing the role and capacity of the BTWC's ISU, and strengthening the intersessional program of work after the 9th review conference. So straight on to the recommendations that we've got a sort of headline for the detail. You're going to have to read the report, I guess. So our recommendations include the establishment of a standing body for the review of science and technology, the development of a BTWC code of conduct for life scientists, which I think feel, at least this is a sort of Bradford view, that for a code of conduct to be meaningful and for it to work, then I think it needs to go hand in hand and be accompanied by education and awareness campaign. Otherwise, I suppose the risk is that the code of conduct, the people that are supposed to be subscribing to it don't appreciate the sort of wider implications of what we refer now to as biological security. Then I fear that the introduction of a code on its own won't necessarily work. And then finally, provisions of practical mechanisms for experience sharing, such as the creation of searchable databases and a platform for peer review exercises and experience exchange, bring my brief comments on MX1 and on MX5 to a conclusion. So thanks very much indeed for listening, and I'll now close my presentation and hand you to Dr. Brett Edwards from the University of Bath.
Thanks.
Over to you, Brett.
Hello there. So this is necessarily a very short summary of quite a very complex and contested set of issues, and I'm trying to do two in about 9 slides. So apologies if I trample over your area of expertise, but hopefully this maintains a general interest among those in the audience. So in this talk and the next talk, we're going to be dealing with the Chemical Weapons Convention, and so I'm going to briefly talk about that for a moment and then move on to two key issues in which have both affected and have an impact on the broader regimes, but at the same time the kind of weight from these events is also now being affected by broader events and trends internationally. So there is a shamelessly stolen timeline here. Of course, the history of chemical warfare and attempts to control chemical weapons is now very long. The key idea is that there is a global prohibition against the development, stockpile, and use of chemical weapons, and the key treaty that sits at the center of that is the Chemical Weapons Convention, which sits in the context of a broader regime. And in this talk and the next talk, we'll talk a little bit about some of the key capacities that this treaty system has, including verification and investigation. Generally speaking, this treaty regime emerged in the 1990s and is the product of its history. And so while in some respects it is a very, very impressive treaty regime, particularly in terms of its systems of verification, there are some long-standing challenges facing that regime, but also some ones that are coming into sharper relief as a result of the kind of changing nature of geopolitics, the way in which dual-use industry is evolving, and also trends in conflict which are changing, continue to mean that the kind of chameleon nature of chemical weapon threats continue to evolve. Now, it goes without saying that chemical weapon use in Syria occurred in a deeply fraught international environment. And while in the early days we did see Syrian chemical disarmament, with Syria giving up the vast majority of its capability, we also saw Syrian membership to the Chemical Weapons Convention. It's clear that even at that point, the fault lines that would shape Syria's membership to that treaty were in place. Today, there are, of course, two key issues facing the Chemical Weapons Convention and also the UK as an international actor. This is the credible accusations that Syria has retained a chemical weapon capability, and of course the continued use of chemical weapons by the Syrian military. Now, it's clear in the context of a divided Security Council and in the context in which Russia, for example, continues to deny that chemical weapons have ever been employed by the regime, that there is a need for support of a wide range of investigatory, archival and criminal mechanisms. There is no kind of clear endpoint in mind as far as I'm concerned, and I think the best approach is depressingly kind of continued incrementalism in which we continue to build evidence repositories and so on, and ensure that individuals may be held account in the future. And it's important in relation to this case, and it's also important in relation to affecting decision making in other states who may decide to use these weapon systems. Now, Novichoks were something that, of course, kind of came into the public imagination seemingly out of nowhere. Of course, for many people who are familiar with the Chemical Weapons Convention, this was an issue that was known about, but not perhaps commonly discussed. Of course, been sidelined during the negotiation of the Chemical Weapons Convention. Now, Novichoks were clearly covered by the scope of the CWC. However, it was clear in relation to technical issues such as the schedules, there were some ambiguities on declaration practices around these agents. However, it wouldn't be until about 2018 where this issue really came home to roost. And of course, we saw two high-profile incidents in 2018 and 2020. Now, it's clear that in the context of a fraught Executive Council, we've still seen agreement on the fact that Novichoks are covered and should be included in the schedules. There are some technical issues, but I can't go into those. However, the main issue, of course, is the fact that we have a suspicion of Russian non-compliance, which has been clearly stated by many states, and which, of course, Russia denies. Now, in terms of going forward, I think it's clear that we have seen some incremental progress in the context of the CWC, which was perhaps the best we could see. But at the same time, this needs to be supplemented by a wide range of measures. In particular, in the UK, I'd be very eager to see further public inquiries and criminal proceedings in relation to this issue. I think this is a test case for a type of event, which unfortunately we will see again in the next few decades. And I think also this incident is kind of forcing the UK and other states to reevaluate their understanding of biological and chemical terror threats and how they are communicated to the public. And that super condensed version of that talk is all from me. So thank you very much. And I will now pass on to Michael Crowley.
Thanks, Thanks, Brett. I'm just trying to share my. Right, just bear with me 1 second. Okay. Hello, everybody, and here we go. Come on, share now. Come on. Right. Great. Okay. Sorry for that technical delay. Following on from Brett, I'd like to explore how the Chemical Weapons Convention and the OPCW have tried to address two distinct types of chemicals. And firstly, I'll speak about CNS acting chemicals. So there are a range of chemicals, some naturally occurring and some that are synthesized, that act upon the central nervous system, the CNS of humans. And many, of course, have been employed in medicine, for example, as anesthetic agents or analgesics or antidepressants. Now, under the Chemical Weapons Convention, the development and use of all toxic chemicals, including CNS acting chemicals, as weapons in armed conflict is absolutely prohibited. However, there are differing interpretations as to whether the use of CNS acting chemicals as law enforcement weapons is permitted. And regrettably, the convention's implementing body, the OPCW, has not clarified whether these chemicals can legitimately be used for such purposes, and if so, under what circumstances and constraints. And of course, this has implications. In October 2002, Russian security forces used aerosolized CNS acting chemicals in a large-scale operation to free over 900 hostages held by heavily armed Chechen separatists in the Dubrovka theater in Moscow. And although the hostages were released, over 120 died as a result of the direct effects of the chemicals used or from airway constriction due to their incapacitation. And an undetermined additional number of hostages suffered, and some continue to suffer long-term damage or died prematurely in the years after the siege. In 2012, the UK's Defence Science and Technology Laboratory published results of trace analysis of clothing and urine from survivors, indicating that the weapon used comprised a mixture of two anesthetics, carfentanil and remifentanil. To this day, the Russian authorities have refused to publicly disclose full details of the weapon they employed or to provide information on stockpiles or current development of such weapons. And there are concerns that Russia's actions may encourage other states to develop or acquire similar weapons. There are also concerns that the rapid advances in relevant chemical and life sciences, particularly genomics, synthetic biology, medical pharmacology, and neuroscience, will be harnessed to weapons development. A 2014 survey conducted by Professor Malcolm Dando and myself at Bradford University identified research and other activities potentially applicable to the study or development of these weapons in a number of countries. And this included Chinese manufacture and promotion of CNS acting weapons targeting individuals and their possession by the Chinese security forces, as well as Russian computer modeling of car motives against groups of individuals in enclosed spaces, and exploration of potential CNS acting chemical agent interaction with human receptor sites. And concerns have continued. In 2019 and 2020, the United States, in its annual reports reviewing CWC compliance, and also during meetings of the UN Conference on Disarmament and the OPCW, raised concerns that both Iran and Russia were conducting research into CNS acting chemicals that was inconsistent with the CWC and was, to quote, for offensive purposes. In response to these concerns, over the last decade, there have been concerted attempts by a growing number of states, led by Australia, Switzerland, and the US, to encourage the OPCW to collectively resolve the CWC ambiguities concerning development and use of these weapons. And as part of this process, a number of states, including the UK in 2013, formally declared that they were not developing and did not possess these weapons. However, some states that conducted research in this area remained silent or have opposed these discussions within the OPCW. In November 2020, at the annual Conference of States Parties, 29 states issued a joint statement calling on all states parties to collectively clarify that under the CWC, the aerosolized use of CNS acting chemicals is inconsistent with law enforcement purposes. As an aside, it's noticeable and strange that the UK was not among the signatories of this joint statement. Because of COVID, the November conference was cut short, so there was no time to discuss the statement. The conference is due to reconvene in April and presents an important opportunity for states to address this issue. And we would recommend when states are considering this that the states parties, if they haven't already done so, align themselves with the joint statement, clarifying that aerosolized CNS acting chemicals shouldn't be used for law enforcement. And it's particularly important for the UK to do so, given its previous progressive position on this issue. And until the OPCW collectively determines the CW's applicability in this area, we recommend that CWC states parties should introduce national moratoria on development, manufacture, promotion, transfer, acquisition, stockpiling, and use of all weapons employing such agents. Now I'd like to turn to talk about a completely different set of chemicals, and that is the riot control agents. As I'm sure you're all aware, riot control agents, RCAs, are tear gases and pepper sprays, and they're defined by the CWC as any chemical not listed in one of the 3 schedules of restricted chemicals that can produce rapidly in humans sensory irritation or disabling physical effects which disappear within a short time following termination of exposure. So they're completely different to the CNS acting chemicals I spoke about earlier. And the use of RCAs as a method of warfare is prohibited under the CWC, but the convention does permit the use of such chemicals for law enforcement, including domestic riot control purposes, provided that they're used in types and quantities that are consistent with such purposes. And of course, as we all know, RCAs, just trying to press, there we are. RCAs are employed around the world for law enforcement, notably for controlling or dispersing crowds, as well as for facilitating arrest and restraint of individuals. However, human rights organizations such as Amnesty International have documented how they've been frequently misused for serious human rights violations, most commonly in non-custodial settings to restrict, intimidate, or punish those participating in legitimate public protests the world over, and also in prisons, detention centres, or police stations of certain countries to ill-treat individuals. A recurring medical concern has been their use in excessive quantities in the open air or in confined spaces, including hospitals, prisons, and homes, where the targeted individuals cannot escape. And in such situations, serious injury or death can result from the toxic properties of the chemicals or from asphyxiation. And this, of course, is particularly true for the old, the young, or the sick. Human rights organizations such as the Omega Research Foundation and Amnesty International have documented how these long-standing concerns have been exacerbated during the COVID-19 pandemic. Medical professionals have highlighted the danger that RCAs could raise COVID-19 risk to individuals by increasing respiratory tract susceptibility to infection. And furthermore, RCA-induced coughing and increased mask removal exacerbate the threat of contagion, as does the breakdown of social distancing caused by RCA-induced disorientation and crowd panic. Such effects, clearly relevant to the policing of public assemblies, would be exacerbated further if RCAs are used in confined spaces, notably prisons and other places of detention. Consequently, we recommend that all CWC states parties must ensure that the use of riot control agents for law enforcement purposes are consistent both with international human rights law and the Chemical Weapons Convention, taking into account the increased risk to health due to COVID-19. Now, the OPCW has collectively taken some action on RCAs. In 2014, the Scientific Advisory Board issued advice to all CWC states detailing what chemicals should and should not be used as riot control agents. And now I think it would be good for the OPCW to give further guidance to states about what quantities of RCAs could be legitimately used and safely used, and to highlight relevant obligations under human rights law to ensure that such RCA use is proportionate, necessary, and does not endanger life or health. And the current situation could dramatically worsen as a result of contemporary development, marketing, and subsequent deployment of systems that are capable of delivering significant amounts of RCAs over wide areas or extended distances. Now, in addition to the potential misuse for collective ill treatment or punishment of crowds, such wide area RCA delivery mechanisms could be employed as force multipliers in conjunction with firearms, making lethal force more deadly on a large scale. Although they're nominally deployed for law enforcement, they may also be incorporated into military arsenals and subsequently could be used in armed conflict in contravention of the CWC. In 2018, the OPCW Scientific Advisory Board warned that availability of certain systems opens up the possibility that they could be filled intentionally with alternate types of chemicals, including chemical warfare agents or CNS acting compounds. And these concerns are exacerbated by current weak trade controls that could result in the acquisition and misuse by a range of non-state actors, including private military or security companies, armed opposition groups, and terrorist organizations. Bradford University and the Omega Research Foundation have documented the development and promotion of wide area RCA delivery mechanisms, including indoor dispersion devices, external area denial devices, multiple projectile launchers, large caliber projectiles, and delivery mechanisms that are mounted on remote weapon systems or unmanned ground vehicles, and a range of drones. And to date, their widespread employment, thankfully, has not been documented. But we may now be at a tipping point where proliferation, use, and misuse may be beginning, as witnessed by the Israeli security force use of commercially available drones against mass Palestinian protests along the Israeli-Gaza Strip border in April and May 2018. Now, these drones were documented flying above the crowds, dropping tear gas projectiles onto people below, in some cases upon peaceful protesters, bystanders, journalists, and field medical facilities. We believe that this issue must be addressed now before RCA drones and other wide area and remote control RCA delivery mechanisms proliferate and widespread misuse becomes unstoppable. Consequently, we would recommend all CWC states parties should collectively establish an OPCW process to determine those types of RCA delivery mechanisms that are prohibited under the Chemical Weapons Convention, and also develop guidance on the appropriate use of permitted RCA delivery mechanisms. Thanks a lot for that. And I'd now like to pass on to Professor Malcolm Dando from the University of Bradford. Okay, over to you, Malcolm.
Thank you, Michael. I want to raise a slightly different slant on what we've been discussing. The report that we're showcasing in this webinar is titled Biological and Chemical Security After COVID-19. And although I think most of the people attending the webinar are people who are old friends I've known for some time. One of the striking things we have to confront in the coming months and years is that the concern about biological and chemical security will be much more widespread, and there will be many people who are not really conversant with the kind of things that we traditionally talk about, that we have to find some way of communicating with. So what I want to do here is just to illustrate one particular new way of dealing with this in regard to one particular kind of audience. My co-presenters here are two people who are experts in design and production of cartoons. As I know well from previous work I've been involved with them, where we tried to summarize some of the implications of a horizon scan on bioengineering in a series of cartoons. What I want to address here is something that we've all been aware of since at least 2005, 2006, and that is that very, very few practicing life scientists actually have any great knowledge of biological security in general and dual use in particular. And it's interesting to note that they also have very little understanding of even the history of biological weapons. We've also known since the Lemon-Roman report of 2006, and as illustrated here by the Royal Society report in 2012 on brainwaves, is that this low level of awareness doesn't only occur amongst microbiologists, but is widespread within the whole of the life sciences. The Ukraine and the UK, in a paper that they produced for the Biological Weapons Convention, reflecting on their considerable experience in trying to deal with this issue, strongly suggested that there had to be new mechanisms, new ways in which we tried to contact and engage scientists in the issue of biological security and dual use. So, how do you go about trying to construct a cartoon that might engage people in the scientific community? And what we did as a group was to try to think of a text that might usefully engage people, in particular starting off with a conference and then the kind of discussions that we all know about in conferences. And this led us then to this idea, illustrated in this first page of the cartoon, of a conference taking place in 2017, where an eminent presenter is pointing out that it's so easy now for the genome of systems to be changed, and then being asked by somebody in the audience over coffee whether they'd considered the societal implications of their work. And the gentleman replying that, of course, they had very good laboratory biosafety, but the questionnaire then raises a question of dual use and the question of the Biological Weapons Convention. And despite behind him having the Inter-Academy panel title of Doing Global Science, is not aware of the problem of dual use or the conventions. And finally, in a side room on the bottom, the questionnaire raises the question of dual use and the Biological Weapons Convention. And then that leads on to preventing biological weapons after the pandemic, where the same presenter is videoing in to his colleagues and arguing very strongly that what we have to do now is to make sure that everybody in our institute is fully aware and capable of trying to assist in preventing the misuse of our benignly intended work. And then the contributors in the second line to the discussion point out that there are now readily available material that can be used and techniques like team-based learning exercises which can help to convey this kind of material. And finally, the gentleman who started the whole thing is seen really recommending in this post-COVID situation that all of his colleagues think about how they can help engage in preventing their work from misuse. Thank you very much. Over now, back to Professor Lijun.
Hello. Hello, thank you very, very much. And we're just slightly over time, but it's okay. And I would think you would appreciate it's we have the team of the expertise and try to cover a lot of the topics on the CWC and BWC. Of course, this webinar has two aims. One is for the general public to get some sense of what the BWC and the CWCs as the current burning issues, and also we also have some recommendations through our research on this very complicated international levels of research. We also covered, trying to use a new methodology, use a cartoon to, to help the people to think these interesting topics and the things. We have some time for the questions. If you want to ask the questions, you can either raise your hand or you can use your chat box. I think Alistair had the questions. Alistair, you can unmute your microphone or the video. You can ask a question. Thank you, Alistair. Alistair, can you? Okay. While waiting for Alistair to unmute his microphone, I have a question from Trish. Does the panelist see COVID-19 and the questions surrounding the transparency of the regional pandemic will further the aim of the BWC? Well, who want to answer these questions? Yeah. Malcolm, you want to take over or you want me to answer these ones or whatever? Okay,
Lijun, I could try, yeah. if possible. Okay.
Yeah,
thank you. Thanks a lot for this question. It's actually quite important, and especially given that WHO has just started its sort of investigatory mission in China. So it would actually be interesting to see what the results of that exercise would be. And definitely, I mean, it's COVID. I think that we all agree that COVID-19 would have implications for the negotiations and for what has happened in Geneva within the context of the BTWC. But I think that at the same time, it's very much important to ensure that conspiracy theories and disinformation is also countered, because as the pandemic started, there was a narrative building up that may be a biological weapon, which was luckily very quickly stopped and countered with facts to show that that's not the case. So I think that it's very much important that those issues are addressed, not only within the public health sector and the global health and global health security, but also within the disarmament realm. And it's important that we have this dialogue between the public health and security communities ongoing, because there's a lot of overlapping issues. So this is my take on that. Thanks.
Yes, I want to add it a little bit further on these questions. I think asking the original tracing and asking the transparency do need a scientist involvement. So we want to highlight the WHO's roles and scientists' roles in these, quite important issues, especially aiming for the BWC to reach its aim. And so the WHO's involvement, the science involvement is crucial. So therefore, recently BWC has these peer review exercises. So this is really, really important functional, like the SAB, Science Advisory Board on the OPCW. So I think this is certainly will strengthen the aim of the BWC. Thank you. I'm sorry, Alistair and Malcolm, we won't able to, let you to use your microphone, so you need to type your questions in the chat box. But Malcolm, you can use your, microphones to answer any questions or raise any hands. Okay.
I just wanted to point back to where we started with the UK biological security strategy, which was aimed to deal with natural, accidental, deliberate disease for humans, animals, and plants. And therefore, it seems to me inevitable that if countries, states have this kind of integrated approach, then what happened in regard to the epidemic will have implications for the way that state parties view the conventions. And I think if this is approached properly by civil society, we can enable a much more sophisticated, integrated approach to all of these aspects of disease within our policymaking communities. So I think one of the good outcomes of this dreadful event could be that we end up with a much more secure situation in the future.
Okay, thanks, Malcolm. I have questions from Maria. Ask, are there prospects for deepening the cooperation between the BWC and the WHO on biosafety and biosecurity? In what directions it may evolve? I can answer the questions. WHO and the BWC has been working very, very closely, although they are, paralyzed, different organization or whatever you want to call it. But there are some, meetings and talking about the content of the WHO, and also WHO has already published the Code of Conduct of Laboratory Biosafety. So lots of the information has been shared and cooperated. So that's the basic things. That's what we addressed for that. So I think the good cooperation is, as I mentioned, the BWC have this peer-reviewed exercise initiated. So I think setting up the kind of the SAB, Science Advice Board, could involve a lot of the WHO's involvement on that. But the details of how this peer review exercise can be formed, what the content of on that, and all the things need to be, carefully examined. And in the UNIDIA, Dr. James Neville has recently published a document on these ones. I would refer you to check on that. Sorry, Alistair, I have your questions, especially to Simon. Ask Simon, do you think scientists will be more interested in biological security following the discussion and the allegations about the range of the COVID-19? Simon, you want to address Alistair's question?
Yeah, I can have a go at that one. Can you hear me okay? Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it goes without saying now that we fully appreciate that disease is a security issue, and I think that this is something that's possibly significant. And since at least in the West, insofar as the West is concerned, we didn't experience SARS and MERS and the sort of epidemics that have taken place in the East. I suppose for everybody now, I think it's shaken us to our very core, hasn't it? That it's more than apparent now that disease is a security issue. I think the thing about the Wuhan issue was that at first, there was all this speculation about this being a biological weapon, and then that sort of seemed to morph into, was this an accidental sort of a leak from a laboratory, which of course is very difficult for the UK because we had our own leak at Pirbright, and this resulted and ended up in a FMD outbreak, which was very costly, and that was even more worse than that. It was dodgy filters in a government facility. So in some ways we have to sort of be careful at not pointing the finger, maybe in that regard where the Chinese are concerned. So it could have been an accidental disease outbreak. I think that it's more than apparent now that the link between naturally occurring, accidental and deliberate disease is a continuum, and it relates to humans and animals and plants, and that it should be taken more seriously. So in terms of the direct answer to the question, do we think that scientists will be more interested in biological security following the Wuhan incident? I'm not sure about that. I think the solution to this, of course, is sort of firmly in the hands of the people that are producing vaccines, and the solution and our future seems to depend very heavily on the success of the vaccines and the very widespread take up. Quite how we vaccinate upwards of 60 million people in very short period of time is not at all obvious. What it's going to be like after, who knows? I suppose we experienced Spanish flu, but that was 100 years ago, and I'm not sure if the records are fantastic about the role of the scientific community in that. I mean, my institution are interested in this from the position and the point of view of continuity, so business continuity, and what their concern mainly is that their financial stakeholders, in other words their banks and their insurance companies, are happy in terms of business continuity, that the university can continue to deliver its core provision, and all of the relevant sort of measures are in place. So I think that interest in education, awareness raising, and codes of conduct is possibly not going to come from the science community, but maybe from financial pressure from stakeholders who may be interested in institutions from the point of view of financing them, from the point of view of banks, and from the point of view of insurance companies. I mean, the question will be, all of these people that are conducting life science research and CRISPR gene splicing experiments in universities in the UK, in Europe, and around the world, are they sufficiently well trained, and are they insured and are the banks happy with the way all of that's being done up until February 2021? So I'm not sure whether the scientists' interest will come from the scientific community. There's certainly been an upsurge in interest. We've been contacted by various different people and organizations, but I fear that no, not necessarily. I think that it's more than apparent that biological security and disease, is a really important security issue. But of course, everyone's reliant on the vaccine. So I think maybe where financial stakeholders are concerned, we might start to see some movement.
Okay, thank you, Simon. I have a question from Alina, and I would like Professor Malcolm Dando to answer her question. Malcolm, can you just repeat the question and answer it? Yeah.
Alina's question is really concerned the question of compliance with the Chemical Weapons Convention and the Biological Weapons Convention. And it's partly to ask why we have two different conventions with two different sets of arrangements, and partly to ask what can we do when we run into very big differences between states as to how to go forward. It seems to me that what we have at the moment with these two different conventions is a historical accident. I don't see that historical accident being put together for some time yet, but to the extent we can, we should try to see, and that's what our report tries to do, is to see these two conventions linked and covering the whole range of chemical and biological misuse. In regard to this second aspect of your question, it really is the fact that there are big differences about how we should proceed with verification within the Biological Weapons Convention and what the meaning of compliance is in regard to the Chemical Weapons Convention. But what we need to understand all the way through this is that what joins us together is much more important than what differences we have. And so it seems to me that all the way through, despite the difficulties, we should be trying to achieve consensus. If we can't achieve consensus, sometimes we have to go without consensus. But always we should be trying. And just remember, in terms of the Chemical Weapons Convention, we did agree a means of dealing with the Novichok question earlier last year. And what we need to do is to keep building on that kind of approach. For instance, in regard to the central nervous system acting chemicals, there may be a way through between the opposing positions on that in the Chemical Weapons Convention, and that further discussion and work by the Scientific Advisory Board may lead us to a situation where we can deal with it in the same kind of way as the Scientific Advisory Board is working on how we deal with questions of misuse of toxins. It could be that sometime in the not too distant future, we have a planned way forward to dealing with the question of incapacitating central nervous system acting chemicals. And just to finally say, great to see somebody from the St. Petersburg State University attending our webinar. Cheers.
Thank you very, very much, Malcolm. We do have several questions, and because we are still a little bit over time, I will quickly answer the questions, and then, yeah. Sorry. Matthew asked, do the panel feel that the pandemic have overall raised or lessened the attractiveness of the state starting an offensive biological weapon program? why do you feel this? And I'm not quite sure. I think it certainly gives the people or state rethinking how we're going to do this, and also because of the rethinking take quite long time. I'm not quite sure this will be a lesson. Obviously, I would think they might raise the attractiveness on that. That's my personal view. We can discuss this a little bit further on. I have the question from the Rubina. It's from Pakistan, and she asked how BTWC region can play a major role in the controlling of the biological arms. What is a global substitution obstacle for the implementation of the biosecurity policy, and what are the opinions to improve biosecurity measure in the post-COVID-19, how BTWC discouraged the non-state terrorism group to not use a biological weapon, particularly in the future. Well, I think your question is so big and so covered too many things. I think all the BTWC has aimed to solve these problems, and they have tried to, for example, they try to get the agreement on the code of conduct. That's something is aiming for. And if you think how you discourage the non-state terrorism group to do that, probably from my point of view, they see the fear of this pandemic, but I'm not quite sure. It's too big question. We will answer you shortly and separately. Okay, and Tatyana want to touch a little bit. So I just finish some Alistair's questions before I give to the Tatyana. Alistair asked, could there be a merit in getting the CW coalitions to raise the matter of the proper delivery mechanisms for the RCAs? Michael, do you want to answer this?
Yeah, thanks, Lijun, and thanks, Alistair. Yes, definitely. I think, of course, the CWC is framed in terms of national security concerns, and that seems to be the paradigm in which discussions occur. But because the CWC specifically does address riot control agents and prohibits as a method of warfare, but and allows toxic chemicals, well, certain toxic chemicals to be used for law enforcement, but with the provision that the correct types and quantities are used. I think that formulation does allow the OPCW to address, and they should address, the types and quantities issues in connection with RCAs and means of delivery. And I think it's important for civil society in all its forms, human rights organizations, medical organizations, the scientific community, to bring its concerns or their concerns collectively to the OPCW in this context. And I think the CWC coalition is, which is a global coalition of civil society concerned with strengthening and implementing the convention, is an excellent forum by which we can do that. Thank you.
Okay, fine. Thanks, Marco. Finally, I give floor to Tatyana to briefly answer the questions, to adding the point. Then I'll do the closing remarks. Thanks, Tatyana.
Thanks a lot, Lijun. Just in continuation of what you were saying in answer to Rubina's question, and the need for biosafety and biosecurity, also the linkage there. If you look at the biosafety manual, that is the 4th edition that the WHO has just published, and you refer to that in your remarks, it actually addresses dual use research of concern. So I think that that's one positive development, and there have been a number of other guiding tools published by the WHO recently that actually also try to address broader biosecurity issues. So we see sort of a tide beginning to turn there, and we see that security issues, like broader security issues, are being addressed more into the public health and global health security domain. So I think that that's one development that definitely deserves attention. And might be one possible framework for further engaging practitioners in biosafety fields, but also in public health, in the life sciences, with broader security issues. That's the only point that I wanted just to make. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very, very much, Tatyana. Due to the time limited, I'm sorry, I want to close up these sessions. And you can see we covered quite a lot of topic, both in the BWC and the CWC. There's a lot of issues. We're very happy to have further discussion with you guys. Our project have the dedicated web page on our university website. You can look on that. We have the webinar introduction. We said we will put this webinar recording to the YouTube as soon as we can do that. And also we would very much appreciate you can do a small survey so that we can, get some feedback on the report and other things. Finally, before you go, I want to play some interesting video we played to summarize our report of our seminar. I hope you enjoy that.
Most people don't like thinking about biological and chemical warfare and terrorism. However, recent developments have emphasized the importance of the public discussion of the global control regime directed at these weapon systems. Chemical and biological weapons have a long history. A history in which the drive to develop more destructive and inhumane weapon systems has been tempered by attempts to prohibit these weapons at the international level. The centerpiece of global efforts to control biological and chemical weapons are the biological and chemical weapons prohibition regimes. These regimes help ensure against the development and proliferation of weapon systems, as well as reducing the appeal of these weapon systems to nefarious actors. Today, there are several areas of the Biological and Toxic Weapons Convention which could be strengthened. This could help ensure greater trust between states, facilitate greater cooperation in areas such as public health, and ensure the long-term adaptability of the regime to things like advances in science and technology. A cross-cutting theme of all of these is a need to strengthen Biological and Toxic Weapon Convention institutions. In relation to chemical weapons, there is a need to strengthen global institutions in a number of areas which will enable us to identify and destroy all chemical weapons production facilities, ensure aid and justice for the victims of chemical weapons attacks, as well as accountabilities for perpetrators, to halt the development and use of CNS acting weapons, and to prevent the misuse of riot control agents. For further information, you can access this report the link below this video.
Thank you very, very much. This is end of webinar sessions. Last, I will say a very big thanks to all the postgraduate research office. Without their support and help, we can't see how we can manage on these difficult, webinar sessions. And thank you very, very much for your participate, and have a good evening, good day, or good afternoon, whatsoever. If you have any questions, just contact us. Thank you.